Is Vancouver safe? That's the question we're getting to the bottom of in today's video. I'm going to talk about the perception that people have of Vancouver, my own personal experience, actual crime statistics, and at the end of the video, I'm also going to talk about some of the safest neighborhoods in Vancouver, as well as the areas you're going to want to avoid. So let's get to the bottom of whether or not Vancouver is a safe city to live right now. Hey, it's Sebastian Albrecht with the Living in Vancouver, BC team, and we're talking about crime in Vancouver and whether or not Vancouver is safe. So first of all, I want to talk about what the media is saying. And if you pay attention to the media, if that's all you're seeing, the headlines, most of us are going to feel inundated with information about how unsafe Vancouver is. I mean, after all, the media needs to sell bad news. We love bad news, and that's what sells, that's what gets viewership, that's what attracts eyes. The big headlines, sort of that clickbaity type of title is what's pulling people in. So if I'm looking at media coverage of what's going on in Vancouver, I definitely would have the perception that crime is out of control in Vancouver and that it's really unsafe, that you're not going to feel comfortable in Vancouver. Now, I would say the perception of the public gets colored by that media coverage that we're seeing. And if you look at media coverage really over the decades, it's always been flooded with this type of quote unquote hysteria, this negative slant on what's going on in Vancouver. And I would say it's most likely the case in many cities, many places around the world, but that's not necessarily what's going on the ground. But the perception that a lot of the public has over crime in Vancouver is definitely that it's a problem and that it's probably getting worse. And there are things that happen in the city that have been leading to more crime. And if you've been watching my videos, you definitely have heard me talk about crime being an issue in Vancouver, but that violent crime isn't much of a factor, that it's more petty crime that you have to worry about. So there's places in the world, you know, where you're gonna have to worry about whether or not you're gonna get mugged, carjacked, murdered. Those types of things really don't happen in Vancouver. I mean, they could and they may occasionally, because we are a metropolis of roughly 3 million people. Not everybody is sane, not everybody is doing things that they should be doing, of course. But in terms of sort of a global scale, those types of crimes are well under control and highly unusual. But where we do have some issues is around petty crimes, such as, you know, a bike being stolen, car being broken into. That type of thing is pretty problematic, and it's problematic almost in the entire city, no matter where you are. But there are certain areas that the petty crime is more of an issue than other areas. And there's certainly areas where I would be a little more aware of my surroundings with some concern about violent crime. That would be pretty random. That again is quite unusual, and I would say that for the most part, I feel really safe moving around Vancouver no matter where I am. All right, so let's get into the data about crime in Vancouver. I'm taking data from 2022. So at this point, we're near the end of 2023, and I do have to admit, you know, this is somewhat out of date, but it is the most recent data that we really have to be able to compare Vancouver to other Canadian cities and what that sort of crime data indicates. So first of all, the crime rate. So we talk about crimes per 100,000 people, and Vancouver is just above the national average in that rating. We have 5,891 crimes per 100,000 people in Vancouver in 2022, according to Stats Canada. And for the national average, it's 5,668. So pretty average. One thing, when I was doing some research about these crime rates and, you know, how it compares from one city to another, one thing that the Vancouver Police Department explains is that it is a little problematic trying to compare what happens in Vancouver to other cities across Canada, primarily because the city of Vancouver is so small and it is so dense. And something that I've talked about quite a bit on this channel is that Vancouver is a tiny city in comparison to many other cities, such as Calgary, Edmonton, Ottawa, Toronto. The geographic area of the city of Vancouver is minuscule in comparison. And so the crimes tend to be concentrated in the most densely populated areas, which in our case is the city of Vancouver. But the city of Toronto, as an example, has a dense core, but then it has a much less dense part of the city that is still the city of Toronto, and it is included in those overall crime statistics. And that does bring their crime stats down much lower than they would be if they concentrated just on the city core, similar to city of Calgary as an example. So that is something that we have to take into account when we're comparing, and one of the reasons why Vancouver's numbers appear higher than they would if we included the entire region. One of the stats that appears to be a little more accurate than just comparing the crime rate is a crime severity index, and that gives more weight to more serious crimes and less weight to less serious crimes. So as I've mentioned, Vancouver has, I would say, more of an issue with less serious crimes than more serious crimes such as murder. So we might find more bike thefts in Vancouver than you might find in another city, but considerably fewer murders as an example. So this crime severity index in Vancouver has been going down pretty substantially over the last 10 years. At this point, the CSI, I believe, is at 92.4, which is above the national average again, but it has declined about, I believe it's 12.3% since 2013. At the same time, the national average has increased 22%. So we are above average, but again, going against what we sort of get the impression from all of the media out there, the significant crimes have been on a very steady decrease in Vancouver and are well under control in comparison to what's going on in the rest of Canada. These numbers also indicate, again, my impression that most of the issues that we have in Vancouver are more around petty crime rather than on those more serious crimes. All right, so let's talk about my own experience. And I think if you've been watching my videos that I do put out every single week, be sure to like and subscribe, all about moving to and living in Vancouver. These videos, I talk a lot about crime in Vancouver and how safe it is and how safe I feel. So my own personal experience is there's no place in Vancouver that I feel unsafe. Again, though, I am a larger male, and so that does color my experience. I'm not viewed, I think, as an easy target. And so generally, I'm aware of my surroundings in certain parts of the city that perhaps, other people may feel are unsafe. I pay a little more attention, and definitely there are things that go on at different times of day. Obviously, a Sunday morning in a certain area is a different experience than a Friday night, as an example. That's something, in any big city, you need to be aware of where you are and what's going on around you. But definitely me personally, I don't feel unsafe anywhere. Even, the area that most people would point to as the most dangerous would be the downtown east side. And that's an area that I feel quite comfortable in, moving around, walking. It's a very tightly knit community. It's a neighborhood in and of itself that many Vancouverites feel uncomfortable with and isolated from, but the people that live there know one another and look after one another, and they're looking to protect one another, and they're also just trying to get by. The issue these days, in the downtown east side, and part of the reason that it's become so bad is drugs, the fentanyl crisis, so drug addiction, basically. There's a lot of people in the downtown east side that are severely drug addicted, but also mental illness. And there's nowhere for them to go, nowhere for them to be taken care of. And so on the downtown east side, there is a certain degree of unpredictability. And that's one of the reasons that I do feel safe, but I'm paying attention to what's going on around me, because there could be somebody who's just completely losing it and having a very stressful experience. Incidentally, it is a little more visible, that type of stressed experience for a person on the downtown east side because of COVID. And we're all feeling a lot more stressed. But if somebody's living on the street, has a drug addiction and a mental illness, their ability to cope with the stresses that they're feeling are not the same as you or my ability to cope. So, that's not something that I would necessarily expose my children to. And so the downtown east side is not an area that I would go for a Saturday morning stroll with my kids, and definitely an area that I would sort of avoid with my children. We're not going to be playing in the street, but personally, I do feel safe there. And there's definitely areas that I also need to think of, back to the petty crime, where I'm not going to be leaving things in my car. I'm not going to be leaving my bike unlocked downtown anywhere, but even locked. And so you get, if you have a bike, if you have a decent bike, you ride it to where you're going, and you lock that up with a lock that may or may not be worth more than your bike, but you also usually take off your seat post. Some people will also remove their tire and lock that to the bike as well. There's lots of ways, you know, you just have to be a little more cautious, a little more aware. The other thing I would say, going back to being with a family, there's some areas of the city that are more affected by what's going on the downtown east side. And as an example, if you live in the West End Sunday morning and you want to take your kids to the park, well, you're going to be dealing with some people who were sleeping there overnight and doing drugs. And that is, you know, a reality of our city at this point, and I think a reality of many cities, but specifically a warmer part of Canada where people can survive on the streets, and they're doing that, and they're spending their money, whatever money they can scrape together, to purchase drugs, and then they're using those drugs. So there's people, you know, I definitely hear stories about people saying, wake people up that are sleeping on a slide at this park in the West End, as an example. And that's part of what they do if they want their kids to go there. That's not the experience that people have in many of the surrounding neighborhoods of Vancouver that we would consider safer, but it is an experience that people will have if they're living very close to the downtown east side, or sort of like a very tight ring around that area. So whether that's the West End, the Fairview Slopes, Mount Pleasant, those areas all have that impact from the downtown east side. So there's definitely safe neighborhoods where there's very little crime in Vancouver. These neighborhoods tend to be the neighborhoods that are the lowest density and the ones that are furthest away from the downtown east side, or hardest to get to from there. So those neighborhoods would be Kerrisdale, Point Grey would be another one, and Shaughnessy. Those three neighborhoods generally are viewed as the safest neighborhoods where you're going to see the lowest impact of crime. Definitely very few violent crimes. They can happen, but incredibly rare. Even petty crime is relatively rare. And in terms of my own experience in those neighborhoods, I grew up in Kerrisdale. You know, you would hear of the odd house that would get broken into and the odd car that would get broken into. That stuff still happens, but it is incredibly rare. And I would say, you know, the reasons for it are that there is such low density. The average income is incredibly high. People typically have alarm systems, and so they're not viewed as an easy target by the people who will do petty crime. It's a little bit tougher for them to get there. It's a little bit tougher for the crimes to be perpetrated, and then it's also harder for them to get away. So for all those reasons, Kerrisdale, Point Grey, and Shaughnessy tend to be the safest neighborhoods in Vancouver. Now, if you do want help finding a safe place for you and your family to live if you're moving to Vancouver, be sure to reach out. I am a real estate agent that's helped hundreds of families move to Vancouver, and I can help you as well. My contact information is right there on the screen. Reach out anytime and we can start talking about your move to Vancouver. Now let's get back to the video. And then of course, there's also areas to avoid. You know, as safe as Vancouver is, there are areas where the majority of the crimes happen. I would say, you know, it's going to be no shock to anybody that the downtown east side is very easily the one area, if you're trying to avoid crime, you probably shouldn't live there. It is a part of the fabric of that community, unfortunately. It's just the point at where we are at the moment, and it is almost entirely drug related, right? And it's people that are trying to get a quick fix for the drugs that they need or that they feel they need, that they're addicted to. And so they're going around other parts of the city, breaking into cars and stealing bikes and stealing basically stuff that they can take pretty easily. Violent crime can also be an issue in this neighborhood, but it is predominantly related to people that are mentally ill, and they just don't know what's going on. They're scared. They're acting out of their minds. There can be a risk of a crime being perpetrated that is, you know, a violent crime on the downtown east side, but it is not incredibly common. As I mentioned earlier, there is sort of a ring around the downtown east side where you're more likely to be impacted by petty crime because it's pretty easy for the people that live in the downtown east side to spread out from there. And so you do see the West End more highly affected in the downtown core. You see Fairview Slopes, you see Mount Pleasant, Grandview Woodlands, Commercial Drive, Strathcona sort of being the ring where generally there's a higher level of crime. There's higher crime rates in those neighborhoods. And so if you're really trying to stay away from that, you have to move out of the more highly populated, densely populated neighborhood. But I would say You can live very safely in those neighborhoods. You just need to be a little more protective of your belongings and a little smarter about it. So you definitely can't leave your door unlocked. You definitely want to lock your car. You definitely want to take everything out of your vehicle, whether you're parked on the street or parked in an underground parkade. Leave nothing visible, because if something is seen by the person who wants to take something, it becomes an easy target. You just kind of have to be smart about it in those neighborhoods. And frankly, you kind of have to be smart about it in the outlying quote unquote safe neighborhoods as well, because you just never know. I live in one of those areas that would be considered very low crime rate. But even where I live in a single family residential neighborhood, I don't leave things in my car and I make sure the door is locked. Over the course of living in this neighborhood for about 10, 12 years, I've had my car was broken into. Well, I should say, no, it wasn't broken into. Somebody opened the door and took stuff out of my car because I didn't lock it. And so there have been a few times where I've been dumb enough not to lock my car, and somebody's checked the door handle and walked by and realized the door was unlocked. And a crime of opportunity, I would say, is really what it is. But I've also left my front door wide open, again, pretty dumb, but just in the going through my day, I'm rushing inside to answer the phone or something, coming home, I've just forgot to latch the door. That's happened a couple times in the dozen years that I've lived here, and you know, nobody comes inside. I've left my garage door open a few times, and generally people come by and let me know that it's open, one of my neighbors, and then we make sure that it's closed. Crime still happens even in the safest neighborhoods, but going back to areas you may want to avoid, the entertainment district, Granville Street downtown, that would be the core of the entertainment district. And that is an area where you will see a higher level of violent crime. And it's not related to drug addiction or mental illness. Well, it could be mental illness, but it's more related to people partying, young males drinking too much alcohol, typically males, sorry guys. But, you know, there are fights that break out. And there have been instances where random passersby have been punched by somebody, violently assaulted. And that would be the one area I would say that I would have my head really on a swivel, especially late at night. You know, if I've gone out to a concert or met a friend at a bar downtown or something like that, you just want to be a lot more aware. And if you're living in that area, say on Richards in Yaletown, you're getting affected by kind of the noise, and you know, there's hoodlums that just want to, they're letting loose, and they're letting loose in a way that isn't always socially acceptable. There's an impact of that. And if you want to avoid that, then you want to avoid the entertainment district in downtown Vancouver. But that's really it. You know, those would be the things to keep in mind when you're looking for places to avoid and being safe in Vancouver. All in all, Vancouver is a safe city. There's a lot of information out there about Vancouver being dangerous or crime-ridden, but that's not really the reality of the city. I think both based on the actual statistics, but also on the experience of people living here, it's safe not only for you, but also for your family. It's a great place to raise kids, whether you're living close to the city core or in the outer suburbs. Both are incredibly safe in the grand scheme of things. And if you want to explore the city a little more, I got a couple videos for you. This one over here is all about some of the best neighborhoods for families to live in Vancouver. And then if you're looking for the suburbs, this playlist, it's gonna explore all sorts of the best suburbs to live in today. So explore both those videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in next week's video.